Meanwhile, the White House says there's a framework agreement on the table for a 6-week ceasefire in Gaza. Israel has not turned it down. Well, now the wait is on for Hamas to agree. Talks are ongoing here in Doha, with parties hoping to have a deal in place by Ramadan in around a week's time. Well, Rosiland Jordan joins us live now from Washington, D.C. Rosiland, so talk us through what we've heard from U.S. officials then.
U.S. officials briefed reporters here in Washington earlier on Saturday to say that they have a framework in place for a 6-week pause or ceasefire in the war on Gaza. According to these U.S. officials, the Israeli government has more or less signed off on the deal, and now everyone is waiting to hear from the leadership of Hamas on whether it will meet its obligations under the deal, namely to release a number of captives held in Gaza who belong to one of 4 categories: the elderly, women, the sick, and the injured. Now, so far, there has not been any response from Hamas, but U.S. officials said that they were continuing negotiations, not just in Doha, but with partners in the region in order to try to make this framework, which they're now calling the first phase or phase A, to get to the next step, which would be one step closer to an end to the war in Gaza.
Yeah, Rosalind, just a few days ago, President Biden seemed to be rowing back on the prospect of an imminent deal, but now it appears a deal is back on the table.
Well, that's because you saw a renewed burst of diplomacy, of high-level diplomacy, after Thursday's incident in Rafah, in which Israeli troops fired on civilians who were greeting a convoy truck that was bringing humanitarian aid. The Israelis claim that they felt threatened by some in the group. Those on the ground say that the Israelis simply opened fire without justification. There are investigations underway. But because of that incident, U.S. officials were very worried about having this negotiated 6-week ceasefire fall apart after weeks of negotiations between Doha and Paris and Cairo. And so the renewed sense of optimism, if we can call it that, is because officials on Saturday here in Washington believe that there is still this commitment to try to get this ceasefire in place before the start of Ramadan.
And Ross, just a final thought to you. We're hearing that Israeli War Cabinet Minister Benny Gantz is due to travel to Washington to hold talks with Vice President Kamala Harris. What more do we know about this?
Well, there are numerous news reports here in Washington suggesting not only that Mr. Gantz will be in Washington in the early part of the coming week, but that he is supposedly going to meet with the Vice President Kamala Harris, as well as with the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on Monday. According to these reports, the 2 U.S. officials are talking everything Gaza with Benny Gantz. They're talking about the need to increase dramatically the amount of humanitarian aid to the Palestinian people living inside Gaza, efforts to try to engage in some sort of prisoner swap undergirding that 6-week ceasefire, and trying to actually get to a point where you can get one step closer, not just to ending this war, but to trying to set up the framework for the eventual establishment of a separate Palestinian state. There is a lot there, and it is noteworthy that Benny Gantz reportedly is making this trip without the support or permission of the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. So it'll be very interesting to see, once all of these reported meetings take place, to see what that impact is on the ongoing efforts to set up this framework for a 6-week ceasefire.
All right, Ros Jordan, live for us there in Washington, D.C. Ros, thank you. Al Jazeera's Bernard Smith is in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, and he has further reaction to the prospect of a deal.
This looks like the US is increasing the pressure on Hamas to agree the broad terms of this 6-week ceasefire deal. Hamas says it will deliver its official answer in Cairo on Sunday. That's when mediators from the US, Qatar and Egypt are expected to meet again, according to Egyptian media, and where teams from Hamas and Israel are expected to turn up. It's by no means clear that Hamas is going to accept this deal, though. They have previously insisted on a full permanent ceasefire and the complete withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. demands that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has called delusional. Netanyahu has said he's not going to send anyone to Cairo. These are reports from Israeli media. He's not going to send anyone to Cairo until Hamas gives up a list of all the hostages that are still alive. And again, we'd heard earlier from Hamas that they are not prepared to do this. So both sides, on the face of it, seem still to be far apart. Bernard Smith, Al Jazeera, Ramallah in the occupied West Bank.